This is Thank You Mama, weekly lessons from mothers all around the world. Hello and welcome to Thank You Mama. My name is Anna Teider. My guest today is Kristen Millares Young. Kristen is a Cuban-American prize-winning journalist, essayist, and novelist. Among others, she has written for Time, Guardian, The Washington Post, and The New York Times, where she contributed to Snowfall, The Avalanche at Tunnel Creek, which won the 2013 Pulitzer Prize and a Peabody Award. And last year, Kristen published Subduction, her first novel, which received raving reviews. And I'm very, very excited about it. Hi, Kristen, and welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on, Anna.
Thank you for being here. I'm very, very excited. Kristen, let's talk about Subduction, because I read that there's so many layers to this novel, and do you want to talk about it a little bit and tell me what the book is about and what it really is about?
I love that question because there's what happens, right?
Yes,
and then there's what that story is meant to evoke. Mm-hmm. So I love that, what it's really about. Mm-hmm. I'll start with what happens is that this Latina anthropologist named Claudia is reeling from the failure of her marriage. Her husband has just left her for her sister, and she is in a state of devastation. But like so many people, especially now, in deep grief, having a lot of trauma to process, we keep on marching forward as though time to reflect and recalibrate were not needed. And so Claudia is an anthropologist, and she had been set to go on this research sabbatical in preparation for writing a book about the Makah Nation, which is a Native American tribe, and they are on the northwest tip of the lower 48, and they're an ancient whaling culture. And so she heads out there, bringing all of this damage with her for this research sabbatical. And as soon as she gets there, she starts making really serious mistakes. She begins an affair with the son of her best research participant, whose name is Peter. And Peter has come back to Nia Bay because his mother has dementia, and he really wants to learn some things about his life. His father tragically disappeared when he was younger, and that's a story that he and his mother have told others. But the truth of their role in his father's disappearance and why they concealed the truth of it from their friends and neighbors and family is a secret that they share. To share a secret with someone whose mind is going is a very fraught thing. So he comes back to Nia Bay to try to take care of his mother, but also to kind of get some answers from her about why things happened the way they did so many years ago. So Peter and Claudia begin this affair, but while they're doing this research project together, where Claudia is studying the songs and stories of his family, they're also cleaning up his mother's hoard, because during the time of his absence, she had begun squirreling things away, and to the point where like her living situation was no longer manageable. And the neighbors had been doing what they could, but there's some things that, family has to do. And so he and Claudia are going through this hoard like bit by bit, and he's kind of revealing all these truths about his life. And Claudia is helping him and his mother stay in concert because they have so much history together that it's very easy for them to become antagonistic, or for him to just basically flee conflict. And his mother has a lot of things that she would like to pass on to him. And Claudia basically helps figure out the purpose of the hoard, like what was the idea behind it. And together they help plan a ritual carrying forward of a song and some artifacts that had belonged to Peter's father, and now in the culture of the Makah could be bequeathed to him. And with that song and with all of the artifacts, kind of take his place, his rightful place, and earn his standing in this community. But of course, along the way, a lot of mistakes are made, and Claudia is not always accountable to the decisions that she makes. So the question, of what the book is really about is also about legacy and how we define and preserve our legacies, and, who gets to be the keeper of those stories, and how do we convey all that we've learned, in this life, given how short it is. And there's so many different ways of doing that. Obviously in our mainstream American culture, there is a sense of documentation now, constant documentation, whether before in writing and now, via social media and imagery. And, the Makah culture, obviously many people, Makahs, are on social media and, and produce written documents and things like that. But there's a very long history of an oral tradition and keeping things in a communal memory that is something that is worked on and is seen as really valuable. And so kind of contrasting the needs that Claudia has for documentation of this project and the purpose of that documentation with Maggie's own focus on stewarding this legacy of knowledge, this cultural knowledge for her son. And Subduction is about the conflicts between those interests and how they reflect upon the larger fractals of historical oppression and assimilation and exploitation of Native peoples in the United States.
It's so deep and so multi-layered. I also hear a theme of, which you mentioned early on, of healing before we head on. So taking time to heal, maybe, and to reorganize and readjust to a new situation before we head into something new. Am I right there?
That's absolutely right. And it's so hard because in capitalist culture, capitalist economies, and the cultures that they produce, there's very little time given. It's just no time. Mm-hmm. There's no time for healing, no time for reflection. To the extent that people's stages of life require us to reflect before we transition, or to be able to steward a transition through reflection, it's the culture that we're in the mainstream United States is just produce until you die.
Yeah, just work. The machinery has to keep on going. Have you heard of or read Catherine May's Wintering? It just came out before this winter, and that's exactly the topic of her book, just allowing yourself to winter, as she calls it. She's like, nature winters, and when we face tough times, we should be able to allow ourselves to calm down and hibernate through them and deal with them and heal them before we go on. I can highly recommend the book.
I did read about it, and it is such an important concept, and it's so countercultural. I mean, now, even though, you and I, for example, I think I can hear that we share some values around creating that space for reflection, and yet, I have to fight myself, to take this.
Yes.
And I know I need it. I know that I have to do that for my work. I'm a writer. And yet it's still hard to give myself.
I was just speaking to a bunch of ladies in a women's summit. They devoted it to Mother's Day, and I was moderating a panel with a bunch of amazing women from around the world about motherhood and a career, about why it is still so difficult to have both. And it was very interesting, yet again, talking about the lack of maternity leave in the United States, for instance. And I think that connects nicely. I didn't even know, because in Europe we have an average of a year of paid maternity leave. And one of the ladies said, actually, it's known that a woman needs a year to recover. Her body needs a year to recover after giving birth. And in the United States, there's no maternity leave. And many women just try going back to work right after it. So in this country, there's not even that time to recuperate and rejuvenate.
Oh, I mean, so before I was reporting with my first son, Jack, I was a full week overdue. And the Guardian calls me and says to me, would you be available to cover the story of the Oso mudslide? And I said, yes.
Mm.
And I, I mean, literally, I filed the story and went into labor. I was a week, and I told them, and they're like, "Oh, wait, are you sure?" I'm like, "Yes, but listen. If I go into labor, I'm just gonna hand over my notes, and then we're done, you know." And they're like, "Okay," and I filed that story, you know. And then a few hours later, I went into labor, and I remember I had this feeling of deep satisfaction, actually, to have gotten it in, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I was really
Mm-hmm.
good at, and it was good. I mean, I like to be productive, and as a woman, I've had to really create space for my work, and so it's important that I stand with it and continue to produce in some ways. And yet, you know, I could have taken a nap. I mean, if I had known how
Yes.
little sleep I would be getting in the months to
Yes.
follow,
Yeah.
I should have taken a nap because I was about to go into 24 hours of
Oh
labor.
my God.
You know what I mean? I had
Yeah.
a 24 hours of labor, and
Yeah.
I did that after a full work day. You know, what was that? What was it in me
Wow.
that said yes? You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's the fear that capitalism puts in you that if you
Mm-hmm. Don't
don't say yes,
perform. Mm-hmm. The show must go on.
always. I mean, always. And of course, then as a mother, you know, now, you know, you're multitasking. Now you're trying to get so many things done at the same time. And even mothers who have all the resources that they need, it's just an incredible amount of busy work to just feed the children, like clothe the children, pack them up to go
It's crazy.
places, you know, teach
Crazy.
them everything.
Crazy thing.
It's crazy. It's a crazy amount of
It
work.
is. Kristen, I wanted to go back to the book a little and ask you how did you do the research about the Makah? Or how did the book happen? These are two questions in one.
That's my specialty, so I love that. I was traveling out to Nia Bay just as an interested person. My mother grew up in Cuba and moved to the United States, and I was born in the United States. And my mother's mother was born in Havana, but her mother was from Spain. So my family line, you know, really moves across continents and countries and
Mm-hmm.
oceans, and
Mm-hmm.
you know, tremendous amount of movement, this diaspora. And it was fascinating to me to come to the Northwest. I moved here to take a job at the Seattle Post Intelligencer and to realize that here in the Northwest, perhaps more so, or at least I was more aware of it than I had been growing up in the Southeast and then in California, the active and ongoing political and cultural presence of tribes, and that these people had been here for thousands upon thousands of years, and that this is to really be of a place, not just from it, but to be of it. I started researching the book back in 2007. And so I wrote the book. Probably the book was largely finished in terms of writing in 2016, but just a lot of going out to Nia Bay, staying with friends that I made there, people who have ongoing presence in my life, like Janine Ledford, who's the executive director of the Makah Cultural and Research Center, and Mayor Parker, who is the board chair there, and Jojo and Mardell McGimsey, friends who have hosted me and who, you know, Joe runs a sweat in his backyard and welcomed me and my husband there. And just the generosity and welcome that I was
Mm-hmm.
shown,
Mm-hmm.
so different than it might be for someone who would like come to, let's say, Columbia City, and you know, if they started wandering around just talking to people, how would that person be received? I don't
Mm-hmm.
know. I don't know that they would receive the kind of generous welcome that I received.
Mm-hmm.
And so seeing that cultural difference and finding so much value in
Mm-hmm.
trying to help share those values, or at least to depict them so that people can study what kind of hospitality do we show to others in our daily lives. It feels like especially now with the pandemic, it's a bit of a lost art to host someone. And I worry that that distancing, you know, that reticence is going to have a longer signature than even the virus would require.
I hope it won't.
Yeah,
I really hope
I know,
it
me
won't.
too. I know.
I miss people.
So I know I've been working on myself to start making, you know, dates to see people. I'm still going and seeing people outside, you know, and it's beautiful weather, so it's, you know, a good time for it. But I've been trying to kind of break that reticence, you know, that we had developed over the past year.
Mm.
And so I also did a lot of reading. So I went out to Makah territory. I interviewed people. I told them what I was doing, that I'm interested in writing this book, and it's a novel, and I'm doing a lot of research. And so I interviewed fishermen and elders, and my friend Lila Parton was really wonderful host for me. She had a fry bread stand that she ran out of her home and just amazing pastries and stuff that she would also make. And just hanging out, but also I read basically everything that's ever been written about the Makah or by the Makah or for the Makah and of the Makah. And, through those documents also saw this evolving history of contact that had been so devastating. And yet the Makah have done an incredible job of archiving their cultural artifacts. They call it kind of the Pompeii of the Pacific Northwest because there was a landslide that buried some longhouses in the beach at the Ozette, which is one of the 5 ancestral village sites of the Makah. And so the salt water and the anaerobic environment buried in the salt beach cured all of these baskets and their, bows and hooks and shanks and, all kinds of artifacts, some of which actually ended up having a really important effect on native fishing rights here in the Pacific Northwest, because, of course, the white people were trying to argue that natives had not been using certain kinds of net technologies. And because native technologies were also often using biodegradable materials, they didn't have often the proof that they needed against these white people who wanted to just take all the fish for themselves. And so in this Ozette dig, there was a nettle fiber net that proved the existence of that technology before contact. And it was really important. And it also, that aggregation of those cultural materials, the excavation and the cataloging involving so many Makah elders and tribal members was a huge cultural gathering that has continued. And the Makah Cultural and Research Center has a number of their displays or replicas that have been made, and they have got their other stuff, in kind of a climate controlled environment. So they're very kind of legacy minded, and they're very smart stewards of their resources and have a lot to offer others in terms of how to run a town, really. And they have a fishing fleet, that's a world-class fishing fleet. They're very enterprising, generous, funny, kind and welcoming people. And really, we've been grateful for the learning. And of course, the book also questions even that impulse to want to go and find out and learn. And, what does it mean to be present then and to form community relationships and to show up in community with Indigenous peoples as an outsider. So as much as possible, I just, with the writing of Subduction and the storyline, I'm constantly, which of course is, drama, it's fiction, but I'm constantly trying to have this meta commentary on even what the book itself is doing.
And apropos learning, let's jump to Mama. Let's talk about Mama Carmen. Will you introduce her to me? Tell me a little bit about her and her life.
Well, my mother was born in Havana. Her mother's name was also Carmen. And when she was 12 years old, she moved to the United States. The family moved to the United States. It was in the mid 50s. So they weren't part of that first wave of Cubans who came after the revolution. They actually came before. And part of that was, the dictator prior to Castro, Batista, who had American support through arms and monies and whatnot, was a very tyrannical and feared person. And, my grandparents really wanted their children to have the best possibilities of education and work. So they sold their business and moved to the United States and really sacrificed, their community relations and they loved their homeland. And so for them to give that up and their gamble paid off because their children both were extremely successful. My mom was a Social Security administrator at the highest levels, and she is someone who, in almost all the jobs that she had, she was the first Latina to have that job. So I watched her career flourish and when I was a child, and my abuela helped take care of me so that her daughters and my mother could work. And it was very important to abuela that my mom be so successful, and she was.
And you said she had you have a sibling?
I do, one sister.
Okay. She worked her whole time during your whole childhood?
Yes. My parents were divorced, so, there was not really another option. And thinking now, back now, as I'm a mother now myself, knowing how much work is required to care for a small person, I am amazed by how much my abuela and my mom kind of figured out between each other.
But it's amazing she had her mom's support.
Abuela was very dedicated to the family, and family was first and foremost. And actually, one of the things that when I had my kids, my mom came for a month after each birth to cook and clean and, wear the baby and just make it. And it was so lovely, that time.
Isn't it amazing? I think my mom did that as well. My mom came for 4 months, actually. Initially, she was supposed to stay for 3 months, and then we didn't let her go. And we're like, how about you stay another month? And seriously, I think that was the most beautiful present anybody has ever given me in my whole life. To have my mom there at that period when I became a mom, and to be somebody's child when you become a mom, I think that is so valuable and such a luxury. And just to be under her care when you're so vulnerable.
And it shouldn't be a luxury. It shouldn't be a luxury, right? Because birth is a major trauma. Even no matter what kind of birth you have, it's a major event that requires healing. And our culture is like, get back to work and don't even have your folks around to help you. Yeah. I don't know what they expect of people, of women. Yes. It's too much. Yes. So she brought a lot of joy at that time.
Where does she live?
She lives in Florida.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And how is she doing? Is she retired now?
She is retired, and she really dedicated herself to helping her parents through the final stages of their lives. Mm-hmm. And it's one of those things that, the many burdens, labors that are both emotional and physical,
I know.
Caretaking or something that women, that falls to women.
I know, unfortunately. Yeah. Let's talk about her lessons.
Well, I was just thinking about what I mentioned about her breaking new ground. She came to the United States. She learned language, when she was still a teenager. She watched television for like 6 months to learn English. She's a brilliant woman, really. And, how she navigated this new culture and started a life here and really flourished as someone who has received a lot of the benefit of those sacrifices. It can be hard sometimes to see how I can break ground, right? Wakey Wang wrote this really great book called Chemistry about people who are the children of immigrants as the first generation. There is so much movement and advancement really that can happen for a family upon immigrating, that for those children, what do you do with all of the benefit, all the sacrifice? And so for me, my mother had a tremendous community service orientation in her work. And I find that I am doing the same as a journalist and a teacher and a literary organizer and nonprofit co-founder. So her example of community orientation is certainly something that I brought into my life, and trying to, fill the gaps of what is needed, what people need, what are the places that sustain us as people, what those places need, and to do so as, both a vocation and a profession. So I have been following in her footsteps in that way through my professional activities, even though we chose kind of different methodologies for imbuing that work.
Is she proud of you? She must be super proud of you.
She is. We're very different people. I am, we operate according to different logics, and that can be, of course, difficult. Mm-hmm. But even in our differences, I think she's always been very attentive to helping me and my sister be seen, feel seen as people. Mm-hmm.
Tell me about novels. I love that lesson, and I can't wait to talk about that.
Oh, well, yeah. It's one of the first things, and that my mother gave me was a love of literature. And I've never met anyone who reads more than my mother does. She is one of the fastest readers I've ever come across, but she does read it and just can really read a book a day, or several books. It's amazing. No, she's at a different level. Like her
Wow.
her relationship with the library is a very very sacred thing. And so she has shown me through the act of reading and then discussing novels how literature provides us with a lens into the logic and emotional landscapes behind people's decision making and behind why people are the way that they are. And they're really, literature is one of the best portals that we have into the minds and hearts of other people. And so that was something that she gave me, that love.
Kristen, when I read this, I remembered how when women started reading novels, originally women were the novel readers, and how men used to despise novels, how novels in their beginnings used to have this bad image of junk literature. And I was wondering, do you think that's because exactly of that thing it does, that it enters a human heart and a human soul, basically, which is, I hate generalizing, but a little difficult for men. I wonder if this is why men used to despise novels, because it's easier for men to be rational and scientific, and in the beginning, it must have been hard for them to accept that.
Well, I think there's also something very deeply subversive about seeing through the eyes of another person. And so many patriarchal norms require women particularly, and people in general, to remain emotionally isolated from each other, to not find solace in each other's stories, or to learn each other's injustices and pay attention to those injustices and work together to reverse those injustices. And to the extent that the patriarchy depends on that division, novels are extremely dangerous, right? Because they are a means of connection and a means for for sly subversions of social codifications that have kept women suppressed for millennia. So they have every right to be worried if we start talking to each other
about how we feel and what our lives really look like.
Yeah, and what we're going to do about it.
Exactly.
Right? And what we're going to do about it.
Let's talk about the last lesson that I have, but I think you kind of already spoke about it, about the lesson about thriving in new environments and being adaptable and resilient.
I am now raising my children in Spanish, and I grew up in a multilingual household, but I would consider Spanish to be my second language, and English is my first language. And it's just so interesting to me. It can be difficult to create a bilingual child in this culture because so many of our educational systems are monolingual, and the language instruction is like decorative. It's not the kind of immersive experience that you would need to create a multilingual child. And so I have found it kind of difficult. There's vocabulary that I don't always know. I remember my kids were watching Octonauts in Spanish, and I put they don't get much screen time, but when they do, it's in Spanish. And I was learning terms, because I had never needed to say bottlenose dolphin in Spanish, yes. Right?
Yeah.
And so I could trace the kind of the extent or limitations and expansion of my vocabulary. And I think about my mom essentially doing everything in this life in her what had been a second language and then became a first language, and how her mind had to hold different codes. And that coding was not just linguistic, but also, being a first Latina in many of the positions that she held, and realizing that you are going to be held up as a leader and, and scrutinized and heralded, but certainly, there's not a lot of room for error when you're first. And so I been impressed over the years by the ways that my mom made that look easy.
Before we jump into talking about if there was anything you wish she taught you, do we have other lessons you'd like to share? Or should we jump into the tricky question?
I guess let's do it. It's tricky, so it might take a minute to answer it. you asked me, if there's something that she was not able to teach me. And it's difficult because there are many different ways to be a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, prior generations had to succeed within narrower frameworks because of sexism and patriarchal norms and racism and, ethnic marginalization. And so I have had freedoms in my life that, while technically they were available to her, may not have felt as available to her. And so I have, in many cases of travel or pursuing certain, courses of study and in my profession, and I have been very adventurous in my life. And I think that maybe because she had the central adventure of the life be immigration, her scope after that was a little bit narrower.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly she traveled. We traveled together to other countries, and but kind of using the freedom that her sacrifices made possible was something I had to learn on my own.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's so interesting. That is so interesting. It brings back a lot of my own experiences of having moved to Austria from Croatia and then having moved from Austria to the US, how it does, when you've experienced these things, it's easier to stay put in many different ways. You've gone through so much and you're like, okay, I'll just be here, safely here, and enjoy what I have right now.
Well, in some ways, I feel like now, just for the past year of this pandemic, I have been, of course, more grounded and only, driving places or camping places and things. And so there is something really beautiful about being available to a place in all of its seasons and
Yes.
not to be in a constant state of flux.
Yes.
So I've been enjoying that, actually.
Yeah. Wow, Kristen, thank you so much for our conversation. I have a feeling we could go on for another 2 hours.
I want to start asking you questions.
we just scraped the surface, but I see coffee in our future. I'm fully vaccinated.
I would love that.
Yes, let's do that. But
congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you again. Let me just quickly recap before we leave. So we talked about your beautiful book, Subduction. We talked about Carmen's lessons, which were, as the first one, I have breaking ground, and setting examples with that, but also community orientation through your work, always also serving the community. I have reading novels as a way of studying the human mind and decision making. I have being adaptable and resilient and thriving in a changed environment. And here we talked about being multicultural and bilingual. And then as something she did not teach you, the last point we talked about was this being adventurous and exploring and using the freedoms that we have right now. Is there anything you'd like to add?
I have not always been the easiest daughter to raise. So I am grateful to my mother for hanging in there with me.
I love that. We are all not the easiest daughters to raise.
Some more than others. I have been very assertive since I was very small, and I can only imagine what that was like to have such a sassy child.
Kristen, thank you again.
Thank you. I really appreciate this opportunity.
If you enjoy Thank You Mama and want to help it grow, please take the 2 seconds to leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps. If you'd like to get in touch, you can send me a mail at info@thankyouMama.net. You can also find me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter under Anna Tider, that's Tajder. This was Thank You Mama. Come back next week, subscribe, and tell your friends.